and welcome to the June 2020 learning lesson based on the Contract Professionals Playbook book and e-learning program. We're going to be talking about tips to decrease scope during the rolling pandemic. This idea came to me as I talked to my clients, and on the supply side, customers are asking for three things of their suppliers: to invoke force majeure so that performance can be delayed in the event that the customer cannot accept the performance at the time from the supplier, termination or cancellation clauses for convenience, and then also decreasing scope. So let's look at decreasing scope during this time of the rolling pandemic, meaning we could see successive waves of needing to decrease scope for a duration of many months. So let's look at the contract. So some people want to tear up the contract, cancel the contract. That's sort of a knee-jerk response. What I'm actually hearing is a lot more flexibility in the system, with people wanting to reduce the scope, whether it's temporarily or permanently, to accommodate reduced demand, whether it's the internal stakeholder or an external customer stakeholder. Tip number one, understand how this scope reduction will impact price and know when the revised price will go into effect. So this is my number one piece of advice when clients call me to understand scope reduction. In the playbook, we talk about this in particular, and I know that I do it in the e-learning program as well, is we understand how to increase scope, and there are a lot of mechanisms that you can put into a contract to modify a contract to increase scope. The concern is that we often don't decrease scope. Customers often don't think that they're going to take any of the scope in-house and perform it themselves, and they don't usually see a decrease in demand that would be dramatic enough to decrease scope. In the instances where something has happened, such as a divestiture of a division, and my clients have had to decrease scope, what we often don't understand is how the scope reduction is going to impact the price. So in a flat fee price situation, in a fixed fee price situation, where there isn't any accommodation for fluctuations, this is going to be difficult. You'll have to pull the work that is reduced in scope and almost act like a reverse request for proposal. You'll have to pull it out, get that scope identified, ask the supplier to price that particular scope, negotiate around the price of the scope, and then figure out the mechanism for when that revised price goes into effect with respect to the reduced scope. Now, the reason I say that is because customers are often negotiating extended payment terms. So we saw this in 2008. Now we're seeing it again in 2020, where customers are wanting to push payment terms out past 90 days, 120 days. So in effect, if you're also negotiating payment delays along with reduced scope, you've transferred a lot of burden to the supplier. And so when the price revisions go into effect at the same point in time that you may be extending payment terms, increasing the risk to the supplier for capitalizing on getting capital to support the delivery of services, even if they're reduced, while customers delay payment, can also impact price. So understand these interconnected elements in reducing scope. Number two, understand how the change will result in work reverting to the customer. So this is one of the aha moments when speaking with stakeholders that want to reduce scope is, well, where is the work going to go? And their attitude is like, well, it's not going to go anywhere. We're reducing the scope. And oftentimes, a technical reviewer of the scope will indicate that there's work that has not been accommodated in the reduced scope, meaning either it hasn't been taken out of the scope that's been given to the supplier for repricing, or it's work that can't really be taken out of the scope, and so does that mean that that work reverts back to the customer? This is another sticky issue with stakeholders when we don't reach out to enough stakeholders to determine how a reduced scope will actually impact the various stakeholders that are touched by the services or the products. If we're going to reduce scope in terms of volume, do we have enough for just-in-time manufacturing of multiple locations, for example? And then ensure that the customer has the resources to perform whatever that work needs to be performed, whether it's transferring it to another supplier or bringing it back in-house. There's often been, with these transfers in my long career, a lot of bad handoffs, we'll just put it that way, between getting reduced scope from the supplier and handing off whatever needs to be handed off to the customer internally. Tip number 3, ensure that the stakeholders are clear about expectations regarding anticipating increasing scope at some later point. So this goes back to understanding that force majeure is about excusing performance in the moment. There's a hurricane, it's a class 5 hurricane, my factory is flooded, nobody can get into work, but it's a time-bounded event. A week and a half from now, the flooding should go back down, our factory should be back up and running, so we're asking for an excused performance of a definite time, or delayed performance of a definite time. All right, but what happens with a rolling pandemic where there's an anticipation of reduced scope, but there's an anticipation of increasing scope at some other future date? So I'll use the example of food. So when farmers are farming and they were selling to the commercial restaurant market, the commercial cafeteria market for large corporate campuses, for example, caterers, there was an instantaneous decrease in demand that was really significant. But now we're having to anticipate an increased demand in food for restaurants, caterers, cafeterias at work locations that could potentially be reopening. But what's worse is we could reopen, we could close yet again, and then reopen yet again. So if your services or goods are subject to that sort of fluctuation, be sure that your stakeholders are clear about how they're forecasting their internal expectations, and that your contract is flexible enough for an increase and decrease in scope and services as demand also flexes. Tip number 4, explore how reduced scope will impact performance dates, so either schedule or milestone dates. So with one of my clients on the customer side, we have a standing weekly meeting, and our schedule is a constant agenda item. We are constantly modifying the dates, and we talk about dates moving to the right or to the left. So to the left, quickening up. All of a sudden, something's happened and we're expected to deliver something in 2 weeks when we thought that we had 3.5 weeks. Something else is not happening, and as a result of the pandemic, and so now we're moving it to the right by 2 weeks. The concern is that milestone dates and schedule dates often impact milestone payments or also acceptance. And so when you start reducing scope, understand also performance dates and milestone dates, and make sure that you align all the other payment dates, and understand that these dates are going to be very fungible or flexible in the upcoming months. And is there still a mechanism for accepting the work that remains and paying on the work that remains? This is why I say revise throughout the document. So go through your statement of work or technical specification and any other appendices that you may have regarding schedules, milestones, any sort of delivery matrix or spreadsheet that you may have, and make sure that it all gets refreshed after the scope reduction is approved by both parties. And tip 5, review acceptance, especially ensure that the people and timing are aligned. And so one of the things that one of my customers is not experiencing is any people reduction because everyone's been sent home to work. However, in other areas that I am not directly touching as a contract professional, people are being told that there will be reductions in the force at some point in the future. And so how does your acceptance criteria impact or is impacted by potential people moving within the organization or being let go from the organization? And is your acceptance criteria robust enough for people and timing movement? And if not, then that should also be modified within the scope change reduction. All right, so those 5 tips, and I'd like to welcome you to, if you haven't already, purchase the book, The Contract Professional's Playbook, on Amazon. Note that we now have a partnership with the IAOP. So if you'd like the certificate and the hours, please visit the Simplero homepage /IAOP. If you're not interested in that program, in the certificate program, you can still take the e-learning program at JeanetteKnighton.simplero.com. I look forward to talking to you again. I look forward to hearing from you if you have questions, comments, or observations.